In the quiet, oppressive air of the 1800s Virginian countryside, the shadows of an unsettling mystery began to stretch long and dark across the land. It started with something simple, an odd disappearance. A woman, a slave, was found missing one morning. Her absence went unnoticed at first, just another instance of a worker vanishing from the fields. But as the weeks passed, more and more slaves from nearby plantations began disappearing without a trace. At first, these incidents were chalked up to the dangerous nature of the world they lived in. Slaves were considered property, and often, runaway slaves were punished severely, or worse, vanished in the dead of night to avoid capture. But the disappearances were unlike anything the local community had witnessed before. It wasn't just a matter of runaways. These were people who had simply vanished, no evidence of their leaving, no tracks in the fields or roads, nothing. The houses they lived in were empty, the routines they followed disrupted, but there was no sign of struggle, no trace left behind. As the days turned to weeks, the disappearances spread from one plantation to another. A few at first, and then, as the numbers climbed, it became impossible to ignore. The vanishing slaves weren't confined to just one location, they were part of a larger, creeping mystery. Local farm owners and plantation masters began to whisper about the possibility of some supernatural force at work, something beyond the realm of earthly understanding. But that was unthinkable. The concept of the supernatural was too close to the feared and despised folklore of slaves, the curses, the voodoo, the whispered names of spirits that might steal a person away. The authorities, of course, dismissed these fears. The owners of the plantations, concerned with their wealth, dismissed them as well, as something that might damage their reputation. But they couldn't ignore the fact that each disappearance left a deepening hole, both in their fields and in their minds. The local townspeople were restless. Whispers spread like wildfire, snaking through the backwoods and into the taverns, where men spoke quietly about these vanishing women. But there was no evidence, and those who dared to speak too loudly about it were hushed by fear, and sometimes, by force. The idea of a dark curse or a supernatural occurrence was too terrifying to embrace. So, the mystery festered, hidden just beneath the surface, too terrifying to confront but too strange to be ignored. Soon, a pattern began to emerge. It wasn't just women disappearing, it was always women, specifically, the female slaves. They were young, older, and even middle-aged women. Some had families, children whom they loved, others were isolated, without a kinship to be mourned. The townspeople began to murmur about what could possibly be the reason behind it. Could it be the work of the spirits? Or perhaps something darker still? Those who had been victims of misfortune in their past, those who had already borne the weight of their oppression in this life, began to speak with more clarity. There were rumors that suggested these women weren't merely vanishing, they were being taken. The first accounts of strange occurrences were difficult to grasp. Initially, those who witnessed something extraordinary were regarded as hysterical or delusional, their accounts laughed off as nonsense. But there were enough stories, too many voices, to suggest that something terrible was happening. Among the slaves, there was talk of sightings, of seeing strange lights near the woods, hearing whispered voices in the fields after dusk, and seeing figures moving in the shadows that weren't quite human. Some said the air itself seemed to crackle with an unnatural chill at night. The fear began to spread like a sickness. The older slaves would whisper to the younger ones, advising them to stay close to their cabins after dark, to avoid the fields, and most importantly, to stay away from the woods that bordered the plantations. But the disappearances continued. With each woman that vanished, the people of Virginia became more nervous, more on edge. What was it that was taking them, and why? The authorities remained indifferent for some time. But as the town's economy began to suffer, and the rumors spread far beyond the local population, they were forced to take action. Still, it was an empty, futile attempt. Investigations began, but they were slow and poorly managed. The focus was on the obvious, runaway slaves, and soon those leads turned out to be just as fruitless. No one had run, these women hadn't simply slipped away in the night. They had been taken, abducted, but by what, or by whom? No one could say. The townspeople, too afraid to speak, began to turn on each other. Finger-pointing became the norm, and the fear began to grow, twisting into something even more dangerous, suspicion. Locals began to suspect each other, forming secret groups that whispered about possible solutions. One even proposed that they seek guidance from a well-known practitioner of folk magic, someone who could sense the supernatural. Still, there were others who refused to believe in anything so dark, pushing the possibility of such occurrences out of their minds. Yet even they were aware that something wasn't right. Some began to suggest that the nearby river or swamps might be responsible for the disappearances, though no one could explain how they would account for the utter lack of evidence. And then, with an almost ominous inevitability, someone discovered a trail. It was faint at first, an overlooked clue hidden in the thick, swampy underbrush near one of the plantations. It was a scrap of clothing, torn and muddied. But it was enough to send a ripple of panic through the community. If there had been a trail, there might be something more, some way to track what was happening. But by the time any real effort was made to follow it, the trail had vanished, just like the women. It led to more confusion, and only fueled the fear further. Every dead end, every failed attempt to uncover the truth, made the town feel more isolated, more vulnerable. It was as if something was playing a game with them, always one step ahead. The story, as it seemed to be unfolding, was no longer just about women disappearing. It had become something more, a dark, unfathomable event that seemed to involve the very fabric of the town itself. And yet, with all these strange happenings, the real question remained: what was causing these disappearances? Was it just human greed and fear, or was there something far darker, far more terrifying, at work in the shadows of Virginia's forgotten corners? As the mystery deepened, one thing became abundantly clear: the truth was being hidden, not just by those with power, but by the very land itself. It was as if the earth of Virginia had absorbed the dark history of its past, of slaves, of oppression, and of whispered secrets, and was now returning it to those who dared to disturb its silence. The land, the people, and the mystery were inextricably bound together, leaving a chilling question in its wake: what was it about these women, these slaves, that made their disappearances so terrifyingly impossible to solve? And why had they been chosen? The rolling hills and dense forests of Virginia have always had a quiet majesty to them, hiding the untold stories of those who walked their earth long before the current generations. By the early 1800s, the state was at the heart of the southern plantation economy, with its vast estates producing tobacco, cotton, and rice. Slavery was not merely a part of life, it was the very backbone of this system. The lives of hundreds of thousands of enslaved individuals were intertwined with the land itself. Their labor fueled the wealth of the plantation owners, but their suffering was often buried beneath layers of power and privilege. Virginia's plantations were grand, massive estates surrounded by fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. The estates were meticulously maintained, with large homes filled with opulence that stood in sharp contrast to the grueling work of the enslaved people who made the owners' prosperity possible. For these workers, life was a perpetual cycle of oppression, pain, and uncertainty. Slaves had no rights, no freedom, and were often treated as less than human by their masters. For the plantation owners, their slaves were not individuals but tools to be exploited for maximum profit. The institution of slavery permeated every aspect of life in Virginia. It shaped the laws, the culture, and the very air the people breathed. Within this brutal system, the lives of women were often even more cruelly restricted. Enslaved women worked the fields alongside men, but they also carried the added burden of domestic labor, cooking, cleaning, caring for the children of the plantation owners, and often bearing the children of their masters as well. The anguish of these women was often compounded by their vulnerability to abuse, both physical and sexual. They had no power, no voice, and yet they were the silent, hidden pillars that held up the wealth of their masters. And within this harsh system, the women who disappeared, the ones whose stories began to haunt Virginia in the mid-1800s, were the very embodiment of this exploitation and erasure. To understand what might have driven the mystery of their disappearances, one must first understand the socio-political landscape that allowed such an event to take place. The power dynamics between the enslaved and their masters were carefully constructed. Slaveholders were not just wealthy landowners, they were members of an elite class that controlled every facet of local life. They held political power, economic power, and, above all, the power of life and death over their slaves. The enslaved were not seen as individuals but as a commodity, something to be bought, sold, and discarded as necessary. And within this cold, calculating system, the idea of a slave, especially a female slave, disappearing without explanation was deeply unsettling. Such an event suggested a crack in the system, something that was beyond the control of those who ruled with iron fists. For years, the enslaved women of Virginia had endured horrors that most people would scarcely believe possible. They were forced to endure grueling labor in the fields, facing the constant threat of violence from their masters and the ever-present fear of being sold away from their families. They lived in constant fear of the overseers and the whims of their masters. Every day was a struggle for survival, a struggle for their very humanity in a system designed to strip them of it. But amidst this dark reality, the mystery of the disappearing women began to form. As the first disappearance occurred, it seemed like just another terrible part of the system. Slaves ran away often, and some were known to disappear into the night. But as the weeks passed and more women vanished, the story took on a different shape. These women weren't running, they were simply gone. They didn't leave in the traditional sense. They didn't take their belongings, didn't try to flee. They just vanished. And with each disappearance, a sense of dread began to settle over the communities. It wasn't just the loss of a person, it was the fear of what was taking them, and why. It was during these early days that the first signs of something strange began to surface. Those who lived and worked alongside the missing women began to notice odd patterns, anomalies that couldn't be easily explained. The slaves who were left behind began speaking of strange happenings in the night. Some described hearing footsteps in the dark, whispers in the trees, or the rustling of leaves in places where no one had been. Others spoke of strange lights, glowing orbs that flickered through the woods, appearing and disappearing as though they were chasing something, or perhaps being chased themselves. These signs seemed to suggest something outside the ordinary, a force that was beyond human comprehension. At first, these stories were dismissed as superstition, rumors born from the fear of an oppressive life. After all, there was no reason to believe in ghosts or spirits in the land of the living, especially in a place so grounded in material wealth and power. But as the disappearances continued, the tales of strange sightings and eerie occurrences began to gain traction. Even those who initially refused to acknowledge anything beyond the mundane began to wonder if something was indeed amiss. Something, perhaps, darker than mere human greed was at play. But before anyone could fully comprehend the scope of what was unfolding, another layer of complexity was added to the story. The disappearances seemed to have a strange, inexplicable pattern. It wasn't just that the women were vanishing, it was the manner in which they vanished. Some of them simply ceased to be seen. They were there one day, and gone the next. There were no signs of struggle, no clues as to their whereabouts. They left no trace behind, no broken doors or windows, no signs of a violent struggle. Their homes and quarters were found empty, as if they had simply evaporated into the ether. And in some cases, even their personal belongings were left behind, clothes, combs, shoes, and even food, as though they had been snatched away in the blink of an eye. The unease grew, and the community began to turn inward. What had seemed like an isolated incident now appeared to be part of something larger. It was as though a slow burn had begun in the heart of Virginia, one that was creeping outwards, consuming everything in its path. The land itself seemed to be changing, becoming a place where the rules of nature and logic no longer applied. And yet, despite the growing fear, no one had any answers. No one could explain why these women were disappearing or what was behind it. As rumors spread, the fear of what might be happening began to take on a life of its own. Stories began to circulate about dark rituals and ancient practices, about powerful forces that might be at work in the forests of Virginia. Some said the spirits of the land were angry, that the enslaved women who had suffered so much were seeking vengeance. Others whispered about something even darker, that the plantation owners, the very people who controlled the fate of the slaves, might have a role to play in the disappearances. But in the absence of concrete evidence, these theories were little more than speculation, fragments of a mystery that no one could solve. The truth remained elusive, slipping further away with each passing day. The only thing that was certain was that the women were disappearing, and with each disappearance, the mystery deepened. Fear settled into the hearts of those who had once been certain of their safety, and the town became a place where no one felt truly secure. The deepening mystery left a stain on Virginia's soul, one that would never be fully erased. As the land continued to churn beneath the weight of the mystery, it became clear that the truth behind the disappearances would never be easily uncovered. The very fabric of Virginia's plantation society seemed to be unraveling, and the lives of the enslaved women, those whose names would never be remembered, were now caught in a web of horror and uncertainty that defied belief. The mysterious disappearances of the enslaved women in Virginia had begun to take on an unsettling and even supernatural quality. The once peaceful atmosphere of the plantations, where the relentless rhythm of work on tobacco fields and rice paddies was punctuated by the grumbles of discontent and the crack of whips, began to crack. The heavy air that once held the scent of rich soil and budding crops now carried a different, more dangerous weight, a sense of fear that spread through the land like a shadow creeping across the horizon. The question that lingered in the air was not simply where the women had gone, but what force had taken them and why. More troubling still was the fact that no one, not even those who were closest to the land and its mysteries, could find any rational explanation. The pattern of disappearances was strange, unpredictable, and growing more frequent by the day. Rumors, once whispered only in the dark corners of the plantations, began to spread through the local communities. Those who had once been skeptical of strange stories now found themselves forced to question what they thought they knew. For those living in the towns near the plantations, the feeling of something being wrong had become undeniable. While the local authorities had yet to make any official statement, the growing unease was palpable. Fear manifested itself in subtle ways, from furtive glances exchanged between neighbors to the nervous coughs of men in taverns who had once prided themselves on their stoic composure. People no longer felt safe walking in the woods at night, nor did they feel secure even on their own properties. No one could explain why the disappearances were happening, but the growing sense of dread made everyone wonder, was something malevolent at work? What began as vague whispers about possible runaway slaves soon shifted into more ominous theories. Some locals suggested that the enslaved women had been abducted, taken by force or tricked away. But why would they leave behind all their belongings, their clothes, their personal items? Why would they not try to escape like others who had run away from the fields? The absence of evidence, no signs of struggle, no traces of where they might have gone, led people to consider explanations they had previously dismissed as impossible. As strange sightings in the woods began to increase, with witnesses claiming to see glowing lights and shadows moving in unnatural ways, even the most rational minds in the community were forced to confront the possibility that something far darker than mere human cruelty was at work. The first signs of something truly otherworldly began to appear. It wasn't just strange phenomena in the woods, like the flickering lights or the odd sounds that seemed to echo on windless nights. People started to see things they couldn't explain, figures in the distance, standing just on the edge of the tree line, too far away to make out their faces but too real to be ignored. At first, these sightings were dismissed as trickery of the mind, a consequence of fear running rampant. But as more people came forward with similar experiences, the stories began to form a disturbing narrative. The figures in the distance were sometimes women, sometimes not, sometimes tall, sometimes short, but always shadowy, indistinct, as if they were caught between the living world and another realm entirely. One of the first to speak openly about the strange occurrences was an older man, a former slave who had been freed many years before. He had worked on a plantation in the northern part of Virginia, and after being emancipated, he stayed in the area, keeping a low profile. His testimony was particularly compelling because of the gravity with which he spoke about what he had witnessed. He claimed to have seen one of the women who had disappeared, standing at the edge of the woods on the edge of the property. She was staring out toward the river, her face pale, her body gaunt. But when he called out to her, she didn't respond. And when he went closer, she was gone, as though swallowed up by the very earth itself. This story spread quickly, and others began to come forward with similar accounts. These stories painted a picture of a force that was more than just physical, something that existed between worlds, something that didn't play by the usual rules of life and death. Was it a curse? A ghostly presence? Or something even more inexplicable, a supernatural entity that had a particular interest in these women? Theories multiplied as fear and anxiety spread like wildfire. Some suggested that these women had been chosen as part of an ancient, forgotten ritual, perhaps an offering to some powerful entity that demanded sacrifice. Others speculated that something far darker was at play, perhaps a curse cast by one of the plantation owners themselves, perhaps in an attempt to retain control over their slaves, using dark magic to keep them bound to the land. As the days turned into weeks, the disappearances became more frequent. The fear within the enslaved community deepened, and with it, the stories of strange phenomena began to reach a fever pitch. A woman who had seen one of the missing girls claimed that she had heard her whispering in the darkness, calling her name, but when she turned to face the voice, there was nothing there but the stillness of the night. In another case, a slave from a neighboring estate reported hearing a voice calling to her from the woods, soft at first, but growing louder until it was almost unbearable. When she went to investigate, she found nothing but empty space. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching her. As unsettling as these experiences were, the community began to draw connections that suggested a pattern was emerging. The first disappearances were sporadic, random even, but as the events continued to unfold, they started to follow a disturbing trajectory. There were signs, clues, and inconsistencies that suggested the women who were taken were not chosen randomly. These disappearances were not simply a product of chance, they seemed to be part of a larger, orchestrated plan. What's more, the women who vanished seemed to share certain characteristics. Sometimes they were the youngest, other times the oldest, but always, they had a certain vulnerability about them, an openness that made them susceptible to the pull of whatever force was taking them. But as strange as these stories were, they didn't provide any answers. They raised more questions than they solved, leaving the community in a state of heightened anxiety. Who or what was taking these women? Was there a connection between the plantation owners, the enslaved individuals, and the mysterious forces at work in the land? Were these disappearances a direct result of the systemic abuses the slaves had suffered for so long, a manifestation of their suffering made flesh in the form of an ancient, vengeful power? Or were there more sinister, human motivations behind these abductions? For the time being, there were no clear answers, and the questions only deepened. What had started as whispers among the enslaved community had quickly spread into the larger town. Fear had become contagious, spreading from one person to the next. With each new disappearance, it became harder to pretend that everything was normal. No one could ignore the signs anymore. Some even believed that the land itself was cursed, as if the very soil upon which the plantations were built carried the stain of centuries of suffering. The question that now haunted everyone wasn't whether something terrible was happening, it was what, or who, was behind it. The land was shifting, the air thick with the scent of danger, and the mystery, it seemed, was just beginning to reveal its dark heart. As the disappearances continued to mount, the sense of fear that had once been a distant, vague feeling in the air became something that permeated every aspect of daily life. No one could deny the mounting evidence that something was amiss. The oppressive silence of the plantations, where life had once followed a predictable rhythm, now seemed unnatural. Something was shifting beneath the surface, something both insidious and unstoppable. The plantation owners, who had once been so sure of their control, began to feel the tremors of something they could not understand, much less control. Their power, long taken for granted, seemed fragile in the face of these strange and unsettling events. The initial dismissal of the disappearances as isolated incidents slowly gave way to a more ominous reality. The local authorities, once so dismissive of the growing rumors and whispered fears, began to feel the pressure. There was no explanation that made sense, no clear answer to why these women were vanishing without a trace. And the fact that the disappearances were escalating in frequency made the situation all the more disturbing. But despite the mounting fear and confusion, no one had the courage to confront the truth directly. For most, the idea of something supernatural or unexplainable at work was far too terrifying to consider. And yet, no matter how many theories were offered, no explanation seemed to offer any real answers. The people in the town had always been taught to trust in reason and science, to believe in what they could see and understand. But now, they found themselves confronting something that defied all logic and comprehension. In the face of this mystery, the usual explanations for the unexplained seemed hopelessly inadequate. The initial whispers about runaway slaves had given way to more complicated theories, but even these were thin and poorly substantiated. As people began to talk more openly about what was happening, those who had been initially skeptical started to reconsider their stance. The fear that had once been confined to hushed voices in the corners of the plantation houses was now spilling into the streets, and no one was exempt from its grip. It wasn't long before those who had once dismissed the supernatural became some of the loudest proponents of strange explanations. Among the first to speak publicly about the events was a local woman, a former servant on one of the plantations, who began to recount her own experiences. Her name was Ruth, and she had been born and raised on a nearby estate. Ruth spoke of a time when she had lived in constant fear of the very people who had owned her and the other enslaved workers. She had witnessed the brutal treatment of women on the plantation, and she spoke of how, in her heart, she had always known that something darker lay beneath the surface of the oppressive system in which they lived. Ruth was one of the first to give voice to what many had only dared to think, that the disappearances were not simply the result of human malice, greed, or fear. There was something far older, far darker at work in the land. Ruth spoke with conviction, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a strange certainty. She described how she had heard rumors as a child, tales passed down from older slaves who spoke of ancient rituals, of spirits that could be summoned to take those who had wronged them. At first, Ruth had dismissed these stories as the fears of a people who had suffered for so long that they had begun to believe in anything that could explain their pain. But as the disappearances continued, she found herself questioning whether the folklore she had grown up with might have contained a kernel of truth. As Ruth's testimony spread, more people began to speak out, some recounting strange occurrences they had witnessed, others offering their own theories. Each new story seemed to fit the larger puzzle that was unfolding. One former slave, who had managed to escape the plantation life after years of brutal labor, spoke of a woman who had vanished from their group under mysterious circumstances. He described how she had seemed to be drawn to the woods in a way that wasn't normal, almost as though something was calling her there. He could still hear her voice in his dreams, a soft whispering that seemed to echo in his mind long after she had disappeared. Another man, who had worked as a stable hand on one of the estates, spoke of hearing the faint sound of drums late at night, echoing from the woods, as if a distant ceremony was taking place. Despite the growing number of personal accounts, most of the people in the town remained unwilling to entertain any notion that could be seen as a break from the accepted order of things. The town's leaders, from the wealthy plantation owners to the local officials, continued to dismiss the growing concerns as exaggerated or overblown. After all, this was a time when superstition still held little sway among the educated classes. For them, to entertain the idea of a supernatural force operating in their midst was as absurd as it was terrifying. They needed to find a more rational explanation. There had to be a more concrete, logical reason for these disappearances, they insisted. And so, they launched an official investigation. A group of local men, none of whom had any real knowledge of what was happening on the plantations, but who were respected for their social standing, was assembled to investigate. They interviewed slaves, plantation workers, and even some free men who lived in the town. However, their efforts proved to be utterly fruitless. The women who had vanished left no clues behind. There were no signs of forced entry, no visible traces that they had been taken. The townspeople who spoke with the investigators seemed more confused and fearful than anything else. Those who had witnessed strange lights or figures in the woods were dismissed as being overwrought or delusional. The investigation seemed to grind to a halt, the questions unanswered, the fear growing. And so, the mystery continued, with no one able to provide a solid explanation. Despite the town's best efforts, despite the insistence of local leaders that reason would prevail, there was no logical or scientific explanation for what was happening. The women continued to vanish, one by one, and each disappearance seemed to deepen the sense of unease that gripped the entire region. As the investigations came to a standstill, the whispers of dark forces and supernatural entities continued to spread among the enslaved population. But these tales were not just born from fear, they were stories of survival, of resilience, and of a people trying to make sense of a world that had never given them any sense of control. The growing sense of paranoia and fear among the enslaved workers was palpable, and yet they were trapped. They could not flee, could not escape the oppressive system that had defined their lives. Their only choice was to endure. The mystery of the disappearances had taken root in the very heart of Virginia's society. The strange, unexplained events had forced the town to confront its own deepest fears. Was the land itself cursed? Had the cruelty and suffering of centuries past somehow awakened something ancient, something that could no longer be ignored? No matter how much the authorities tried to rationalize or ignore the phenomenon, it was clear that something was terribly wrong. And as each new disappearance took place, the question that lingered in the air became impossible to escape: who, or what, was responsible for the vanishing of these women? As the disappearances of the enslaved women continued to escalate, the tension within the community reached a breaking point. What had initially been dismissed as isolated incidents now seemed like an undeniable pattern, and with it came an unrelenting wave of fear that seemed to seep into every corner of Virginia. The once genteel facade of the plantation owners' lives had begun to crack under the weight of their own guilt and confusion. The constant need to maintain control over their workers, to keep their estates running smoothly, had begun to falter. More troubling than the mysterious vanishings was the underlying fear that perhaps the power they had so carefully cultivated for generations was no longer as certain as it once seemed. At first, many of the wealthier, more influential members of society simply refused to acknowledge the growing panic. They dismissed the rumors, chalked up the disappearances to superstition, and quietly ensured that any mention of the events was suppressed. The idea that something supernatural or even a conspiracy against their system of control could be at play was simply too much to bear. To entertain such notions would be to question the very foundation upon which their society rested. They could not afford such doubts to fester. However, as more and more women disappeared, without explanation and without trace, it became increasingly difficult for them to maintain this veneer of denial. The disappearances had become too frequent, too unsettling, and too impossible to ignore. Yet, even as the town grew more anxious, the response from those in power remained the same: downplay the mystery, insist it was the result of rogue individuals or a few misfortunate cases, and keep the plantation workers in line by any means necessary. It was easier to blame the enslaved women themselves for their supposed vanishing than it was to confront the reality that something far more sinister was unfolding in their midst. But there were those among the townspeople who could no longer ignore the undercurrent of fear and suspicion that had taken hold. Among the enslaved, whispers began to surface of a force more ancient than the one that governed their everyday lives, the force of retribution. It was a quiet murmur at first, shared between those who had been there the longest, the ones who remembered the darker stories their elders had told. These stories, handed down through generations, spoke of ancient rituals and curses, of forces that could bend time and space, and of spirits that walked between worlds, beings that could take the souls of the living and bind them to the earth for eternity. While many dismissed these stories as the ramblings of a culture that had long been oppressed and silenced, there were a few who could not ignore the eerie synchronicity between the vanishing women and the ancient beliefs they had been raised with. As much as they tried to dismiss it, a growing part of them felt the pull of these old ideas, there was something about the way the women disappeared, the way no trace was ever left behind, that felt like more than just an escape. It felt like something was coming for them, something larger than any single individual could comprehend, something that had been long buried beneath the earth itself, waiting for a moment to rise again. It was in the midst of this fear and uncertainty that a strange incident occurred, one that further complicated the already convoluted mystery. One of the plantation owners, a man named Josiah Whitmore, found himself at the heart of the growing storm. Whitmore was a man of considerable wealth, having inherited a sprawling estate from his father. He had always prided himself on his business acumen and his ability to maintain strict control over his slaves. Under his stewardship, the estate had flourished, and his wealth had only increased. But even Whitmore, with all his influence, could not escape the growing anxiety that seemed to grip his land. One evening, after a long day spent in his study, Whitmore ventured out to inspect his fields, his mind preoccupied with the constant worry that his plantation's productivity was beginning to slip. He had heard rumors of his slaves whispering about strange occurrences, of lights seen flickering through the trees at night, and of women disappearing without a trace. His rational mind told him to dismiss such rumors as superstition, but deep down, there was something in the air that unsettled him. As he walked through the fields, his lantern casting long shadows on the ground, Whitmore noticed something that made his blood run cold. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a faint glow from beyond the tree line, but as he walked closer, the glow grew more distinct. It was not the soft, harmless glow of fireflies or the distant light of a candle, but a strange, unnatural illumination that flickered and moved like a living thing. Whitmore's curiosity, as much as his growing unease, pushed him forward. He ventured into the woods, the ground soft beneath his boots as he followed the light deeper into the forest. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. The glow led him to a clearing, one he had never seen before. The trees were thick with the underbrush of summer, but the space ahead of him was clear, illuminated by an otherworldly light. And there, in the center of the clearing, stood one of the missing women. She was not running or hiding as he might have expected. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring into the distance. Her hair was matted, her clothes torn, and she appeared to have been out in the wilderness for days, if not longer. But the strangest part of it all was that she seemed different. She was not the woman Whitmore had known. There was something hollow about her, something unnatural in the way she stood, as if her very essence had been drained away. Whitmore, desperate for answers, approached her. "What has happened to you?" he demanded, but the woman did not respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the distance, her expression empty, as if she were not aware of his presence. As he reached out to touch her, the ground beneath him seemed to shift. A chill wind swept through the clearing, and the light that had once seemed so steady began to flicker violently. In that moment, Whitmore felt a pressure in the air, as if the very atmosphere had turned against him. The woman's form seemed to distort, her body rippling as though something beneath her skin was struggling to break free. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out, only an eerie, hollow noise that seemed to reverberate in his bones. Panic set in, and Whitmore stumbled back, fear flooding his mind. He turned to run, but as he did, the light flickered one final time and vanished, leaving him in total darkness. He could hear the woman's voice in the distance, a voice that was both hers and not hers, calling his name in a haunting, unnatural whisper. As Whitmore fled from the woods, the echoes of her voice followed him, ringing in his ears and setting his nerves on edge. That night, Whitmore did not sleep. He lay awake, his mind racing with thoughts of the strange encounter. His rational mind told him that what he had seen was a mere trick of the night, perhaps a hallucination brought on by fatigue or stress. But deep down, he knew that what he had witnessed was something far more terrifying. The woman's appearance, her strange demeanor, the eerie light, it all pointed to something beyond human comprehension. The next morning, Whitmore gathered his most trusted men and returned to the site of the encounter, hoping to find some sign that would explain what had happened. But when they reached the clearing, there was no sign of the woman, no trace of her presence. The ground was undisturbed, the air still. The light, whatever it had been, was gone, leaving only the silent trees and the thick, oppressive atmosphere of the woods. Whitmore's encounter with the woman in the woods would mark the turning point in his understanding of the disappearances. No longer could he dismiss the whispers of the slaves, the tales of strange lights, and the rumors of forces beyond his control. What he had witnessed was a warning, one that would haunt him for the rest of his life, and one that would send him down a path of desperate searching for answers, no matter how terrifying those answers might be. The mystery of the missing women had evolved into something far darker than anyone could have imagined. And with that realization came the terrifying truth: there were forces at work in Virginia that no one, not even the most powerful men in the town, could control. The encounter in the woods that Josiah Whitmore experienced began to haunt him more than he ever could have anticipated. His usual firm resolve and rational thinking were rattled by the events he had witnessed. He had been a man of control, a man who built his wealth and power through strategic choices, a man who was never ruled by irrational fears. But now, something deeper, more insidious, seemed to grip him. He had seen it with his own eyes, the unnaturalness of that woman, the way her body seemed to ripple and distort, as if she were no longer entirely of this world. And the strange light that had accompanied her, flickering and flickering until it had disappeared as quickly as it had come, left him with an unshakable feeling that there was more to the disappearances of these women than anyone could possibly understand. For several days after the incident, Whitmore was unable to shake the image of that woman from his mind. He could still hear her eerie, hollow voice, the way it echoed in his bones, calling his name in a strange, otherworldly whisper. He tried to dismiss it as a mere figment of his imagination, the result of a troubled mind overburdened by the weight of his responsibilities. But deep down, he knew something had changed. The fabric of reality had been torn just enough for him to glimpse what lay beyond, and it terrified him. As the days passed, the feeling of dread grew in the pit of his stomach. He began to notice strange things happening on his estate. The slaves, who had once been compliant and silent, seemed to grow more restless. The overseers, normally indifferent to the plight of the workers, were now reporting an increase in tension among the enslaved population. Many of the workers refused to go into the woods after dark, and some claimed they could hear strange sounds, whispers in the trees, the faint echo of footsteps where there should have been none. The sense of unease was palpable. The atmosphere had shifted from one of subdued fear to outright paranoia. Whitmore's unease deepened when he began to hear rumors circulating among the slaves about a growing fear of something that was hunting them. There were hushed discussions in the fields and between quarters about figures moving in the woods at night, and about shadows that seemed to stalk them even in the safety of daylight. Whitmore tried to dismiss these rumors as nothing more than superstition, the product of an oppressed people who had little else to cling to but their beliefs. But the more he heard, the more the cracks in his own rationality began to widen. He could no longer ignore the question that gnawed at him in the dead of night: what had truly happened to the women who had disappeared? Were they really just runaway slaves? Or was there something more, something deeper, at work, something that none of his wealth or power could control? Desperate for answers, Whitmore began to reach out to others in the community who might have more knowledge of the strange happenings. He first approached a local preacher, an older man named Reverend George Holloway, who had lived in the area for decades. Reverend Holloway was well known for his deep religious convictions and his knowledge of the area's history. If anyone could provide some insight into what was happening, it was him. The two men met in the dim light of Whitmore's study, and as they spoke, Whitmore found that the preacher was not as dismissive of the supernatural as he had hoped. Reverend Holloway listened intently as Whitmore recounted his experience in the woods, the strange lights, the unearthly presence of the missing woman. When Whitmore finished speaking, the preacher sat in silence for a long time, his face etched with a mix of concern and something else, something darker. "You've seen the truth, Josiah," Reverend Holloway said finally, his voice low and steady. "What you've encountered is not of this world. These disappearances are not simply the result of runaway slaves or wild tales. There is a darkness here, one that has been buried for centuries." Whitmore stared at him in disbelief. "What do you mean?" What darkness are you talking about? Reverend Holloway paused, looking out the window into the night as if seeking the words that would make sense of it all. This land, it is steeped in history. Blood has been spilled here, suffering beyond measure. The enslaved people who work the fields are not the only ones who have paid the price. The spirits of those who have suffered under the yoke of slavery linger, and some believe that they will never rest until they've taken their vengeance. Whitmore shook his head. But what does this have to do with the women? Why them? Reverend Holloway met his gaze, his eyes filled with sorrow. There are those who say that the spirits of the oppressed, the ones who never receive justice, can call upon forces older than time itself. These women, Josiah, they were not taken by natural means. They were chosen. These disappearances are not random, they are part of a larger cycle. The land has absorbed their pain, their suffering, and now it seeks to reclaim them. The preacher's words sent a chill through Whitmore, and for the first time, he wondered if his wealth, his power, his control over the land were all meaningless in the face of something so vast and ancient. The very land he had built his empire upon had been soaked in blood, drenched in the agony of the enslaved who had lived and died under the whip. And now, that history had come back to haunt him, to claim the women who had lived and worked under his roof. As unsettling as Reverend Holloway's words were, they also struck a nerve in Whitmore. If there was truth to what the preacher said, if the land itself had been cursed by the suffering of generations, then the mystery of the disappearing women was only the beginning. There was something more happening here, something that could not be ignored. The preacher's words continued to echo in Whitmore's mind as he pondered what he should do next. Should he confront this darkness directly, or was it something best left untouched, something better left buried beneath the earth? He knew that he could not simply ignore it, not after what he had seen with his own eyes. But at the same time, he felt a deep sense of helplessness. The more he learned, the less control he felt he had over the situation. In the days that followed, Whitmore grew increasingly reclusive. He spent his nights walking the grounds of his estate, searching for answers in the dark corners of his mind. He knew the land had been tainted, but the question of what to do about it remained unanswered. The more he delved into the history of his own estate, the more he uncovered dark and troubling facts. The land had been built on the backs of those who had suffered, those who had been taken from their homelands, forced into slavery, and denied their dignity and humanity. Whitmore began to see the faces of the women who had disappeared, not as mere workers, but as people whose lives had been stolen from them, whose souls had been bound to the land by the injustice of their suffering. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the disappearances were not just the result of an ancient curse or an angry spirit, they were the land's way of seeking retribution. The women had not been chosen by chance. They had been chosen because their lives represented a history of exploitation and suffering that had gone unpunished for far too long. It was then that Whitmore came to a chilling realization: the land was not simply cursed. It was alive with the pain of the past, and it was demanding justice. The women who had disappeared were not the first to feel the weight of this darkness, and they would not be the last. The land would continue to claim what it was owed, until there was nothing left but the hollow echoes of the past. The more Whitmore considered the implications of what he had uncovered, the more he understood that there was no escaping this. The land would continue to take, piece by piece, until the reckoning had come full circle. He could not outrun the truth, nor could he hide from the legacy that had been passed down to him. The suffering of the enslaved, the unacknowledged pain, had found a voice, and it would not be silenced until it had claimed everything. The women who had vanished were merely the beginning of something much larger, something Whitmore was now powerless to stop. As Josiah Whitmore grappled with the horrifying revelations that had surfaced in the wake of his encounter in the woods, his life on the estate slowly became one of a man haunted not only by the ghosts of the past but by the knowledge that his own complicity had helped fuel this unrelenting storm. The land that had once been a symbol of his success, his proud legacy, now stood as a constant reminder of the cruelty and suffering that had allowed him to amass wealth. Each passing day, the unease grew, as though the very earth beneath his feet was shifting, settling into some darker, more sinister rhythm. The guilt, the fear, and the growing sense of powerlessness gnawed at him, eating away at his resolve. Though he continued to meet with Reverend Holloway to discuss the situation, the preacher's counsel offered little comfort. The spiritual leader had grown increasingly cryptic, warning that the ancient forces at play were not ones that could be simply appeased through prayer or ritual. They were as old as the land itself, fueled by pain and vengeance. Holloway spoke of rites that could perhaps calm the restless spirits, but he cautioned that the price of invoking such rituals could be steep. There was always a price for dealing with powers so old, so untamed. Whitmore began to feel as though he were standing on the precipice of something vast and unknowable, and with every step he took toward understanding, the depths of his ignorance and helplessness only grew more apparent. One evening, unable to sleep, Whitmore took a walk out to the fields, the moonlight casting long shadows across the land. The once comforting sight of his sprawling estate now felt oppressive, as though the land itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. His thoughts were a tangled mess, recollections of the women who had vanished, the strange occurrences that had been reported, and the chilling voice he had heard in the night. He wondered if he had misjudged everything. Had he spent his life under the illusion of control, only now to realize that control was an illusion, that the forces at work on his land were beyond even the might of his wealth and influence? As he walked deeper into the woods, the same sense of foreboding returned. The wind stirred the trees above him, whispering secrets that he could not hear. He stopped for a moment to listen. There it was again, the faint rustling of leaves, the soft murmur of something just beyond the edge of his awareness. Something was watching him, following him. He could feel it. His heart pounded in his chest as he slowly turned, half expecting to see the figure of one of the missing women emerging from the shadows. But nothing. Just the whispering trees and the quiet, unnerving stillness. He forced himself to walk further, the crunch of leaves beneath his boots the only sound in the vast emptiness of the night. He could feel the air growing thicker, the pressure in the atmosphere increasing as though the land itself was closing in on him. He had not come here for any particular reason, he was simply lost in his thoughts, unable to find solace in his own mind. And yet, as he reached a familiar clearing, his breath caught in his throat. There, standing in the center of the clearing, was the faintest glow, a soft, ethereal light that seemed to pulse in the darkness. He froze. His mind raced, and yet, despite the fear that gripped him, something inside him told him that he had to approach it. That this light, this presence, was somehow the key to unlocking the mystery that had tormented him for so long. With shaky steps, he walked forward, the light growing brighter with each step. As he reached the center of the clearing, he realized that this was not just light, this was something more. A figure stood in the middle of the glow, not a woman, but something else, something neither living nor entirely dead. The figure was shrouded in a mist, an ethereal form that seemed to flicker between this world and the next, its outline barely visible, as though it existed in multiple dimensions at once. Whitmore's voice caught in his throat. He wanted to speak, to call out, but no words came. The figure seemed to sense his presence, turning toward him with an unsettling slowness. He could see its face now, pale, distorted, like a mask stretched too tight across an unseen skull. Its eyes glowed faintly, and the air around him grew colder still. The whispers from the trees seemed to grow louder, as if the very forest itself was alive, responding to this presence. In that moment, Whitmore understood the truth of what was happening. The land had been bound by the suffering of those it had enslaved, and now, it was rising in search of retribution. These women who had vanished, they were not simply victims. They were the heralds of something far older, far more powerful than anything Whitmore could have imagined. The figure before him was a manifestation of that power, a creature that existed beyond the boundaries of life and death, a being born from the land's centuries of suffering. The figure opened its mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, a wave of cold washed over Whitmore, filling him with a sense of dread that threatened to suffocate him. He staggered back, his heart pounding in his chest. As he did, the ground beneath him seemed to tremble, and the air seemed to pulse with a rhythmic energy, as if the land itself was breathing, moving, awakening. With a surge of adrenaline, Whitmore turned and fled from the clearing, the distant echo of the figure's presence haunting him as he ran. He didn't stop until he reached the relative safety of his estate, his breath ragged, his mind spinning with confusion and terror. He could still feel the cold touch of that being, the pressure of its gaze on him. And he understood now that there was no running from what was coming. The land had claimed its own, and it was not finished. The cycle of retribution had begun, and there would be no stopping it. In the days that followed, Whitmore grew more desperate. He sought out Reverend Holloway again, but the preacher was no longer the calm, wise figure he had once been. Holloway, too, had felt the shift in the air, and his once resolute belief in the power of faith to guide them through the darkness had faltered. There was a fear in the preacher's eyes that Whitmore had never seen before. It was a fear not of the land or the spirits but of what they were about to face. Holloway spoke in hushed tones now, as if the very walls of his church could not contain the knowledge that had been unlocked. "The land is waking, Josiah," the preacher said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It has been silent for too long, but now, it seeks justice. It demands payment for the blood that has been spilled. And the women, they are the vessels through which this reckoning is being carried out." Whitmore nodded, his mind numb. He had no more questions, no more doubts. Everything he had witnessed, everything he had feared, was now undeniable. The land was alive, and its hunger was insatiable. But there was no solace to be found in the preacher's words. The cycle of vengeance had begun, and it would not stop until the land had taken what it was owed. Whitmore could no longer see a way out. No matter what he did, no matter how hard he tried to fight it, the land had already claimed its price. And soon, it would claim him, too. Days turned into weeks, and the disappearances did not stop. The once bustling estate became eerily quiet, as the very land seemed to settle into a mournful stillness. Whitmore, haunted by the figure in the clearing and by the words of Reverend Holloway, could only watch as the world he had known began to unravel. The estate, once a symbol of his success, now seemed like a tomb. The air was thick with foreboding, and the shadows seemed to creep just a little bit closer with each passing day. It became clear to Whitmore that there was no escaping the past. No matter how far he ran, no matter how much wealth he accumulated, the land would always remember. The spirits, the suffering, the vengeance, it would all catch up to him in the end. And in that final, dreadful moment, he would have no choice but to confront the darkness that had been set in motion by his ancestors and by his own hands. The reckoning was at hand, and there was no turning back. The world around Josiah Whitmore continued to shift, and the weight of the past bore down on him with increasing intensity. Every waking moment was marked by a constant, gnawing fear, as though the very air was thick with an unspoken threat. The estate that had once been a symbol of his success now felt like a gilded cage, and no matter how much he tried to control the narrative, the truth continued to seep through the cracks. The land, with its long history of suffering, had risen to reclaim what it was owed, and with each passing day, Whitmore felt himself drawn further into its relentless grip. The mystery of the disappearing women had only deepened, and with it, a chilling realization took hold of him. The women who had vanished were not simply victims of some inexplicable event. They were part of a larger, more malevolent force that had begun to unfold across the region. Their disappearances, seemingly random at first, were now understood to be part of a dark ritual, a cycle of retribution that had been set into motion long ago, and that no one could escape. The land had claimed them, but it was not done yet. As the days turned into weeks, more and more signs of the land's power began to manifest. Whitmore tried desperately to maintain control of his estate, but it became increasingly difficult. The workers, once loyal, had begun to withdraw into themselves, their eyes haunted and distant. Many of them refused to leave the quarters after dark, fearful of what they had begun to hear and see in the woods. Whispers of figures in the trees, shadows that moved when no one was there, and strange noises echoing through the night filled the air. The once orderly rhythms of the plantation were now disrupted by an invisible force that seemed to invade every aspect of life. Even the overseers, who had been so vigilant in keeping the workers in line, began to lose their composure. They spoke in hushed tones, their faces etched with fear, and it became clear to Whitmore that the land itself had turned against them. One evening, as Whitmore sat in his study, staring blankly at the papers in front of him, a knock at the door broke the silence. It was one of his overseers, a man named Samuel who had worked on the estate for years. Samuel's face was pale, his eyes wide with something that Whitmore could not name, something more than fear, something that bordered on terror. "Sir," Samuel said, his voice trembling, "there's been another disappearance. One of the women, she's gone." Whitmore felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Another one. This had become an all too familiar refrain, but it still struck him with the same force, every time. The thought of these women, his workers, his property, vanishing without a trace, swallowed by the land itself, was a haunting one. He had hoped that the disappearances would stop, that some explanation would be found, but with each new one, the sense of powerlessness only deepened. "Tell me everything," Whitmore said, trying to keep his voice steady, though he could feel the tremor of dread creeping into his chest. Samuel swallowed hard before continuing. "It's Elizabeth. She was last seen in the fields late in the afternoon. She didn't come back to the quarters. We've searched the entire estate, even the woods. There's no sign of her, no trace. It's like she just vanished." Whitmore felt his stomach tighten. Elizabeth was a young woman, a quiet, hard-working soul who had been with the estate for years. She was well liked by the other workers, and she had never given any indication that she would run away or disappear. Her sudden absence felt like a cruel confirmation of the fears that had been creeping into his mind. The land, it seemed, was reclaiming them one by one, pulling them into its depths, and there was nothing Whitmore could do to stop it. He stood up abruptly, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "We need to find her," he said, his voice cold with determination. "No more waiting. No more searching in the dark. We will uncover the truth." Samuel nodded, though his expression was filled with doubt. He knew as well as Whitmore did that there was no real way to stop this. No matter how hard they searched, no matter how many men they sent into the woods, they would never find Elizabeth. She was gone, taken by something beyond their understanding. And they both knew it. That night, Whitmore couldn't sleep. The image of Elizabeth's disappearance lingered in his mind, and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside his window seemed to echo with something darker, something ancient. He had always prided himself on his ability to face challenges head-on, to find solutions and take control of his destiny. But now, for the first time in his life, he felt utterly powerless. The land was not something that could be controlled or reasoned with. It was alive in ways that defied logic, and it was consuming everything in its path, including him. The following morning, Whitmore met with Reverend Holloway again. The preacher's demeanor had changed since their last conversation. There was a new heaviness in his eyes, a grim recognition that the land's curse had begun to tighten its grip on everything, and there would be no escaping it. "Reverend, we need to do something," Whitmore said, desperation creeping into his voice. "These women, they are being taken. Vanishing without a trace. And I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending that there is an answer, that there is a way to stop it. Please, tell me there's something we can do." Holloway looked at him for a long time before speaking. "Josiah," he began, his voice slow and deliberate, "the land does not forget. It never forgets. The suffering, the torment of those who have been oppressed and denied their humanity, it has been etched into the very soil. And now, the spirits of those who have been wronged are rising, demanding justice. The disappearances are a symptom of something much larger. The land is reclaiming its own, and it will not rest until it has taken what it is owed." Whitmore's heart sank as he realized the preacher's words were not meant to offer comfort. They were a cold, hard truth. The land had already begun its reckoning, and nothing they did, no amount of prayer, no ritual, could stop the forces that had been set in motion. The cycle of retribution had already begun, and it would continue until it had claimed every last piece of what it sought. "Is there nothing we can do?" Whitmore asked, his voice breaking with frustration. "We can't just sit back and watch as this thing consumes everything." The preacher shook his head. "You cannot fight it, Josiah. You can only bear witness to what is unfolding. This is not a battle for you to win. It is a reckoning, a judgment that has been long in the making. And now, it has come for you, for all of us." Whitmore stood up abruptly, pacing the room as his mind raced. He could feel the weight of the preacher's words sinking in, suffocating him. There was no escape. The land had already chosen its path, and it was too late to alter the course. The spirits were awake, and they were coming for what was owed to them. The feeling of inevitability settled over him like a heavy fog. No matter how much he struggled, no matter how many rituals or prayers they performed, the land would have its retribution. It had already begun to claim its toll, and soon, there would be nothing left but the echoes of a world that had been consumed by its own sins. Whitmore left the preacher's home with a sinking heart, knowing that no matter how hard he tried to hold on to the remnants of his power, the truth was that he had already lost. The women who had disappeared, Elizabeth, Ruth, and all the others, they were just the beginning. The land was still hungry, and it would continue to consume. And soon, there would be nothing left but the ghosts of those who had been taken and the land that had reclaimed its own. As the days passed in a haze of dread and confusion, Josiah Whitmore could feel the oppressive weight of the land's malevolent power bearing down on him more heavily than ever before. The estate that had once been the pride of his life now felt like a trap, its sprawling grounds and majestic buildings serving only to highlight the hollowness of his existence. He had always been a man who prided himself on control, on his ability to shape the world around him according to his will. But now, he realized with a cold, sinking certainty, that control was an illusion. The land, the very soil he had so carefully cultivated, had never been his to command. It was as though the estate itself had become sentient, a living entity that had grown tired of bearing the weight of its own dark history. And now, it was reclaiming everything that had been built upon the suffering of those who had been enslaved. The disappearances of the women had not stopped. In fact, they seemed to be accelerating, each vanishing more horrifying and inexplicable than the last. Whitmore had been to the woods countless times, searching for any trace of the women who had disappeared, but he never found anything, no footprints, no signs of struggle, no clues that could explain where they had gone. It was as if the land had swallowed them whole, leaving no trace of their existence. Even the workers, who had once been so diligent in their tasks, had become increasingly restless. They whispered among themselves, casting nervous glances at the woods and avoiding the areas where the disappearances had occurred. Their fear was palpable, and it only deepened Whitmore's sense of helplessness. More unsettling, however, was the change in the atmosphere of the estate itself. The weather had become erratic, long periods of heavy rain followed by bone-chilling cold spells. The once vibrant fields seemed to wither, the crops no longer growing as they once had. Even the animals seemed to sense something was wrong. Whitmore had witnessed horses and cattle acting skittish, pawing at the ground and making strange noises as though they, too, were aware of the invisible presence that hung over the land. It was as if the entire estate had fallen under a curse, the earth itself rejecting the unnatural order that had been imposed upon it for so long.